The day Grace Grady buried her father was the same day she realized she had nothing left in the world but $12, a worn leather satchel, and a stubbornness so deep it had grown roots into her bones. The year was 1883, and the Arizona Territory was not a kind place for a woman alone. Dry red earth stretched in every direction from the small cemetery plot outside of Redemption, a town so small it barely warranted a name on any map worth reading. 36 buildings pressed together along a single main street like frightened animals huddling against the cold. And the cold here was not the kind that came with winter. It was the cold of indifference, the particular chill of a place where everyone had their own survival to worry about and no extra breath to spare on someone else's trouble. Grace stood at the grave with her hands folded in front of her, and her jaw set hard as the iron of a horseshoe nail. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned severely under a sun-faded bonnet, green eyes that caught the late afternoon light and held it, and a dress that had been mended so many times it was more thread than original cloth. The preacher had said his words quickly, aware of the coming sunset and the supper waiting at home, and the two men her father had once called friends had already wandered back toward the saloon. No one else had come. She had not cried at the graveside. She had not cried when the doctor told her 3 days ago that Thomas Grady's heart had simply given out. She had not cried when she sat alone in the back room of the livery stable, which was all they had managed to call home these past 2 years since the farm failed, listening to her father's breathing grow quieter and quieter until it stopped altogether. She was not going to start crying now, standing in the red Arizona dust with no one to witness it and nothing to gain from it. What she was going to do, she decided, was figure out what came next. The job board outside the general store had been her first stop after the burial. She had read every posting twice slowly, with the careful attention of a woman who understood that a single wrong decision could cost her everything. Most of the postings were for men. Ranch hands, cattle drivers, miners. One posting was for a schoolteacher over in Tucson, but that was 40 miles and required references she did not have. And then near the bottom of the board, tacked with a single nail that had rusted into the wood, there was a card written in a clean, careful hand. Needed. One capable woman to cook, keep house, and manage domestic affairs at the Maddox Ranch, 12 miles east on the Copper Creek Road. Fair wages. Inquire at the Redemption Bank, ask for Mr. H. Aldridge. Grace read it twice. Then she unpinned it from the board, folded it, and put it in her satchel. She inquired at the Redemption Bank the following morning, presenting herself to Mr. Aldridge, a narrow-faced man with spectacles perched on the very end of his nose, who looked at her over those spectacles for a long moment before speaking. "You understand it's not a simple household," he said. "Mr. Maddox runs one of the larger cattle operations in this county. There are hands to cook for in addition to keeping the main house. It's not light work." "I have been cooking for ranch hands since I was 14 years old," Grace said, which was not entirely true but close enough. She had cooked for her father and the 2 seasonal hands they could afford on the farm, and she was confident that cooking for more men was simply a matter of more quantity, not more skill. Mr. Aldridge studied her again. "He specifically asked for a capable woman," he said, drawing out the word capable as though testing whether it applied. "Then I am exactly what he asked for," Grace said, and held the man's gaze without flinching. Aldridge made a note on a piece of paper, told her to present herself at the Maddox Ranch no later than Friday morning, and folded his spectacles. "The wages are $12 a month," he said, "and room and board." She thanked him. She walked out of the bank. And it was only when she reached the alley between the bank and the hardware store, where no one could see her, that she pressed her back against the sun-warmed wood of the building and let out one long, slow breath that she had been holding for 3 days. She did not cry. She just breathed. The Maddox Ranch was larger than she had expected. She arrived on Friday morning aboard the supply wagon that made the Eastern run twice a week, sitting in the back among sacks of flour and kerosene tins, watching the land open up around her as they left the cramped street of Redemption behind. The red earth gave way to dry grass that rippled in the wind, and ahead of her the Copper Creek Mountains cut a jagged blue line against the pale sky. The ranch came into view gradually, first the windmill turning slowly above the water tank, then the long dark line of the fence posts, then the buildings themselves, a cluster of adobe and timber structures arranged around a central yard. It was not a grand ranch, not in the way she had sometimes imagined wealthy cattlemen lived from the stories she had read, but it was solid. The buildings were well maintained. The fences were straight. There were horses in the paddock that moved with the particular easy confidence of animals that were well fed and well treated, and that told her more about the man who owned this place than any letter of reference could have. A boy of perhaps 14 came running to meet the wagon as it rolled into the yard, and the driver tossed down her satchel with a carelessness that made her wince, though she said nothing. She climbed down on her own before anyone thought to help her. "You the new housekeeper?" the boy asked. He had a gap between his front teeth and a hat 3 sizes too big for his head. "I am," Grace said. "Grace Grady. Where would I find Mr. Maddox?" "He is out with the cattle," the boy said. "He will be back around midday. I am supposed to show you the house and the kitchen and all." She followed the boy, whose name was Eli and who talked steadily for the entire walk to the main house, telling her the names of all the horses and which hands were agreeable and which ones were difficult, and that the cook who had been here before, a man named Peterson, had left in January because of a disagreement nobody would fully explain to Eli, but which Eli suspected involved the biscuits. The kitchen was large, equipped with a cast iron range that had clearly seen hard use, a long wooden table, and shelves lined with the kind of supplies that suggested someone had been trying to maintain a household without quite knowing how. Cans were stacked without order. Flour sacks were left open. The surface of the range had a layer of grease that had been wiped but not properly cleaned. Grace set down her satchel, pushed up her sleeves, and got to work. By the time Charles Maddox rode into the yard at midday, trailing dust and the smell of cattle and open country, the kitchen smelled of something that made him pull his horse up short before he had even dismounted. He stood for a moment in the saddle, nostrils working, processing the fact that real food was being prepared in his kitchen for the first time in 3 months. He was 30 years old, tall in the saddle in the particular way of men who had grown up on horseback, with dark hair that wanted cutting, a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble he never quite managed to keep ahead of, and brown eyes that missed very little. His hands were rough and scarred from years of rope work and branding irons, and the general violence that cattle country did to a man's body without any particular malice. He was not an unkind man. He was simply a man who had been too busy surviving to think about much else, which sometimes looked like the same thing from the outside. He handed his horse to Eli and went to wash up at the pump before going inside, a habit so ingrained he did it without thinking. He pulled off his hat and hung it on the hook beside the door, pushed the kitchen door open, and stopped. Grace Grady was standing at the range with her back to him, stirring something in a cast iron pot with one hand and turning biscuits in the pan with the other, and she was doing it with the absolutely focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this particular thing all her life and had no patience for being interrupted. She had removed her bonnet, and her hair, which she had repinned, was the color of autumn leaves in the afternoon light coming through the window. "Mr. Maddox," she said without turning around, "you can sit at the table. Food will be ready in 10 minutes. He did not ask how she knew it was him and not Eli or one of the hands. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "You are the woman Aldrich sent," he said. "Grace Grady," she said. "Yes. You have experience cooking for a crew." "I do. There are 7 hands at full count. Some of them eat considerably. I noticed the size of the flour supply when I organized the shelves this morning," she said. I put together a list of what will need to be restocked by end of week. I left it on the corner of the table. He looked. There was indeed a neatly written list on the corner of the table. He picked it up and read through it. Every item was accurate. More than accurate, it was thoughtful, anticipating not just what was needed now, but what would be needed over the coming weeks based on the size of the crew. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he asked. "An hour," she said. "I also cleaned the range. The grease had built up on the left burner and it was a fire risk." He looked at her back for a moment, at the straight line of her spine and the efficient movements of her hands, and he felt something shift very slightly inside him, the way the ground shifts just before a tremor, barely enough to notice. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Most recently, Redemption," she said. "Before that, a farm outside of Prescott." "What brought you to Redemption?" There was a pause, brief enough that he might have missed it, like a single missed beat in a piece of music. "My father had worked there," she said. "He passed 4 days ago." Charles was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and meant it. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was completely steady, and she served up 2 plates of food with the smooth motion of a woman who had long ago decided that her own grief was nobody else's business. He hired her. This was not in any real question from the moment he tasted the food, which was the best he had eaten since his mother's table, but he would have hired her anyway based on that list alone. He showed her the small room off the back of the main house that had been set aside for household staff, a narrow space with a cot, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the paddock. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was private and it was solid, and Grace Grady, he noticed, looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been needing for a long time without knowing quite what to call the wanting. "It suits me fine," she said, and that was all she said. The first weeks passed quickly, in the way that hard work always makes time move, filling each hour so completely that there is no room for it to drag. Grace learned the rhythms of the ranch with the same focused attention she brought to everything, discovering which hands liked their coffee strong, and which ones needed an extra portion at lunch, and which one, a taciturn older man named Decker, had a sweet tooth he was embarrassed about and would linger near the kitchen after meals hoping for something sugary without ever quite being able to ask for it directly. She started leaving a piece of dried apple cake wrapped in cloth at his customary place at the table, and Decker began arriving for meals exactly on time, which the other hands noticed and teased him about with the gentle cruelty of men who have nothing to be cruel about and must invent something. Charles Maddox watched his household come together with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. The main house, which had been accumulating the particular disorder of a bachelor's existence, gradually acquired the signs of someone who knew what she was doing. Curtains that had been hanging crooked were straightened. A window latch that had stuck for 2 years was discovered, oiled, and fixed. The kitchen table acquired a vase of dried wildflowers, which Grace had collected from the creek bed on her single afternoon off, and which Charles did not mention, but which he noticed every time he sat down for a meal, which was every day. He began finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings. Not every evening, but more evenings than he had previously been in the kitchen, when he had eaten quickly and gone straight to the work of the accounts, or the correspondence that came with running a cattle operation. Now he would pour himself a cup of coffee and sit at the table and find that Grace was there, finishing the last of the washing up or preparing the following day's bread, and they would talk. Or rather, he would talk, and she would listen with a quality of attention that he found both comfortable and slightly unnerving, the kind of listening that made a person feel that what they were saying actually mattered. She told him very little about herself. He noticed this, but he did not push. He had been raised by a father who believed that privacy was a form of dignity, and that a person's history was their own to share or keep as they chose. So he offered what she offered back, which was the surface of things, the cattle prices and the state of the fence on the eastern pasture, and whether the dry spell was going to hold another week, and beneath it all there was something else being said, something neither of them put words to yet, which is the way these things always begin. It was a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after Grace had arrived, when everything changed. The supply rider had come from Redemption that afternoon with the week's deliveries and also with a packet of letters, 2 of which were addressed to Grace. She had taken them from Eli without expression and put them in her apron pocket and not spoken about them. Charles had been in the paddock most of the afternoon and had not seen her face when she read them. But Eli, with the complete lack of discretion of a 14-year-old boy, told him over supper that Miss Grace had gone very still and very white when she read the second letter. The way a person goes still when something that was already feared becomes confirmed. Charles waited until the hands had cleared out and the yard was quiet, and the evening was settling into the particular indigo dark of an Arizona summer night. The kind of dark that was full of stars and cricket sound, and the distant low complaint of cattle. He went to the kitchen for his customary cup of coffee and found Grace standing at the window with her back to him and her arms crossed over her chest. She heard him come in and turned around, and she was fine. Her expression was completely arranged. Her eyes were dry. Her chin was level. Everything about her posture said, "There is nothing wrong here, and furthermore there is nothing wrong here that I would tell you about if there were." But her hands were shaking. It was barely visible. Another person might have missed it entirely. But Charles Maddox had spent years reading the fine small signals of animals and weather and country, learning to see what was there rather than what was expected, and he saw it immediately. Her fingers, wrapped around her own elbows as she held her arms, were trembling with the fine, suppressed tremor of someone who is using every bit of their considerable will to hold themselves together and almost succeeding. He said nothing about it. He went to the range and poured himself a cup of coffee with unhurried ease, as though this were any other evening, as though the air in the kitchen were not thick with something silent and difficult. "The evenings have been cooling down some," he said, conversationally, settling into his customary chair. "Might be we get some rain by end of the month." There was a pause. He heard her breath, just the one careful breath, and then she turned fully from the window and came to sit at the table, and her hands were in her lap where he could not see them now. "That would be good for the grass," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "It would," he agreed. He drank his coffee. She sat across from him. The lamp between them made a warm circle of light that included them both, and outside the stars were coming out one by one over the dark mountains, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, which is also a kind of saying. "The letter was from a man named Carruthers," she said finally. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the table, at the grain of the wood under the lamplight. "He is a banker in Prescott. He holds a note on the farm my father owned. The farm we lost 2 years ago. He contacted you here. Aldridge must have told him where I was." She said this without particular blame. "The letter says that my father owed $300 on the note. He says that the debt transfers to me as the sole surviving family member." She paused. "He says that if the debt is not settled within 60 days, he will pursue legal remedy." Charles set his coffee cup down. "Can he do that?" he asked. "Transfer a debt from a dead man to his daughter?" "I do not know," she said. "I am not familiar with the law on it." He thought about this. "I know a man in Tucson," he said. "A lawyer. I can write to him, ask him what the legal standing is." She looked up at him then, and there was something in her expression that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the slight widening of the eyes of a person who expected to handle something alone and has just been unexpectedly told they do not have to. "You do not need to do that," she said. "I know I do not need to," he said. "I am offering to." The silence between them was different this time, softer. "Thank you," she said. He wrote to the lawyer in Tucson that night, before he went to bed, and sent it with the rider in the morning. The reply came 2 weeks later, while Grace was in the middle of making the week's bread, and Charles was at the table going through accounts. He read the lawyer's letter twice, then set it down and looked across at her. "The lawyer says Carruthers has no legal standing to transfer the debt," he said. A personal debt does not pass to an heir under territorial law unless the heir has co-signed the original note. Did you ever sign anything related to the farm loans? She had her hands in the bread dough and she paused, thinking back. No, she said. My father never had me sign anything. He was particular about that. He said the farm's debts were his and not mine. Then Carruthers was lying, Charles said simply, or hoping you did not know the law. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands resumed working the dough, pressing and folding with steady rhythm. He assumed I was ignorant, she said. He assumed wrong, Charles said. She looked at him across the table and something moved through her eyes that he could not quite name, something warmer and less guarded than her usual expression, like light moving through a gap in clouds. Thank you, she said, and this time it was different from all the other times she had said it. This time it had weight. He looked down at the accounts. I will write back to Carruthers directly, he said. He will not bother you again. And that was the thing about Charles Maddox that Grace had been slowly, carefully, reluctantly beginning to understand. He did not make declarations. He did not perform. When he said he would do something, it was simply and quietly done. Carruthers wrote one short, cold letter in return and then was never heard from again, and Grace Grady's debt, which had never truly been hers, ceased to exist. The gratitude she felt for this should have been the kind that remained practical and professional. Instead, it was the kind that went somewhere deeper than practicality, settling into the part of her that had been braced for so long against the world that she had forgotten what it felt like to be unbraced, and it frightened her more than Carruthers had. She began to be more careful, not cold exactly, but careful. She remained efficient and capable and gracious, and she continued the evening conversations in the kitchen. But she was watchful of herself in a way that required effort and that she resented requiring. She had watched her mother wear herself away loving a man who was good but impractical, following his optimism from one failed venture to another until she was too tired to continue. And then she had watched her father wear himself away with grief when her mother was gone, and Grace had decided somewhere along the way that the most dangerous thing a person could do was need someone else too much. Charles noticed the slight adjustment in her. He was too perceptive not to. But he was also a patient man, in the way that men who have spent years working with animals become patient, understanding that pushing was worse than waiting, and so he waited. He was present. He continued to show up in the kitchen in the evenings. He continued to talk about the cattle and the weather and the mountains and everything else that was safe and ordinary and required nothing of her. And he continued to see more than she thought he was seeing. In late September, Decker got into trouble. The old hand had ridden into redemption on his day off and found himself in a card game at the Silver Bell Saloon that had started friendly and ended with accusations. The man he had been playing against, a rough-looking individual who had come down from the mines up north with money and a short temper, had claimed Decker was cheating. Decker, who was the most honest man Charles Maddox employed, had not been cheating, and the argument had escalated until someone threw a punch. And by the time the dust settled, Decker had a broken arm, and the other man had a broken nose, and the sheriff of redemption, a tired man named Burke who wanted a quiet life, had briefly considered locking both of them up before deciding the paperwork was not worth it. Charles heard about it through the supply rider on Wednesday morning and drove the wagon himself into Redemption to collect Decker, who was sitting outside the doctor's office with his arm in a sling and his battered pride showing more than his battered face. Grace had insisted on coming, over Charles's mild protest that she did not need to, with the serene firmness that was her particular version of an argument. She brought a basket with food for Decker and also, because she had been in Redemption all of 2 times since arriving at the ranch and she knew every provisioner's schedule, a list of supplies she wanted to acquire while they were there. They drove the 12 miles to town side by side on the wagon bench, which was close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched when the road roughened, and which neither of them mentioned. The land around them was turning toward fall, the dry grass going gold, the mountains beginning to show color at the higher elevations where the scrubby trees grew. The sky was the particular deep blue of an Arizona autumn that always seems slightly unreal, too vivid and too clear as though someone has polished it. "You did not have to come," Charles said, not for the first time. "Decker will want to be fussed over," Grace said. "He will not admit it, but he will." "Decker does not like to be fussed over. Most men who do not like to be fussed over like it very much when someone does it correctly," she said. "The trick is to make it look like practicality rather than fussing." He looked at her sideways, and there was a smile starting in the corner of his mouth that he did not fully allow to arrive. "And you know how to do that." "I know how to do that," she confirmed. The smile finished arriving anyway, quietly on his own time. Decker was indeed grateful, in the way he was grateful for everything, which was silently and with a great deal of effort not to show it. He ate the food Grace had brought and allowed her to check the doctor's bandaging with a series of gruff statements about how he was perfectly fine and did not need anyone worrying about him, which Grace received with a patient nod and continued checking the bandaging anyway. While Grace was at the general store with her provisioning list, Charles went to the sheriff's office to make sure there would be no further trouble from the miner, whose name turned out to be Straw and who had left Redemption the previous morning, which resolved the question neatly. He was coming out of the sheriff's office when he saw Grace. She was standing in the alley beside the general store, the same alley that ran between the store and the hardware shop, and she was alone, and she was holding something in her hands. He recognized it after a moment as a bill of some kind, a piece of paper with numbers on it, and she was standing very still looking at it, and everything about her posture was the same as it had been that evening in the kitchen 6 weeks ago when her hands had been shaking. The jaw set, the spine straight, the absolute refusal, visible from 20 feet away, to show one single crack to the open air and the watching world. But she was shaking. Fine and fine and fine, the trembling she could not quite suppress, running through her shoulders and her hands, the shaking of a woman carrying something far too heavy for far too long, who will not, under any circumstances, put it down in front of anyone who might see. He crossed the street at an unhurried pace, and when he reached the entrance to the alley he stopped a few feet away from her and looked up at the sky as though checking the weather. "Cloud building up over the eastern range," he said conversationally. "Might actually get that rain I mentioned." Grace took a breath, one that was nearly invisible, and folded the paper in her hands. When she turned to look at him, her face was perfectly composed. "We should not wait too long to head back," she said. "I do not want the flour getting wet." "No," he agreed. "Ready to go whenever you are." She walked past him back to the store to collect her supplies, and he followed at the same unhurried pace, and neither of them spoke about it, not then, not in the wagon on the way home, not that evening in the kitchen. But something had shifted between them again. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather comes, the sense of something about to happen that cannot be pushed and cannot be stopped, that will arrive in its own time. He waited. 2 evenings later she told him about the second bill, voluntarily, without being asked. She told him that, when she had been collecting her wages at the beginning of the month, she had received a bill from the doctor in Redemption, who had treated her father in his final days, and that the amount was $22, which was almost double what she made in a month, and that she had been trying to work out how to manage it without the kind of careful accounting that left nothing in reserve for anything else. "I can advance you against your wages," Charles said. "I do not want charity," she said, and there was an edge to it, not quite anger but something adjacent, the pride of someone who has needed things they could not have and has made not needing anything into something close to religion. "It is not charity," he said. "It is a loan against money you have already earned the right to. I am not giving you anything. I am simply moving the timing." She looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Why are you so determined to help me?" she asked. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him, and it surprised them both slightly. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I have watched you work yourself to the bone in my house for going on 2 months," he said, And I have watched you carry everything you carry without complaint, and I have watched you refuse to let anyone lighten it for you, and I think you deserve to not be carrying it alone." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp burned between them. Outside, somewhere in the dark, one of the horses moved in the paddock, and the sound of it was very peaceful. "I am not good at accepting help," Grace said. "I know," he said. "I have noticed. I am not sure it is something I know how to learn. Most things worth learning are hard at first," he said. She looked at the table and then back at him. "All right," she said, "against wages, and I will keep an exact accounting." "I would expect nothing less," he said. She accepted $22 against her next 2 months of wages and paid the doctor's bill. And Charles made an exact accounting note in the household ledger with the same careful handwriting he used for everything else. And what he did not write in the ledger was that, watching her accept help, even that small amount, even held at arm's length with every qualification she could attach to it, felt like watching something important happen. October came in with a blue norther that swept down from the mountains and turned the air sharp and cold overnight, and the ranch shifted into the rhythms of the season's change. The cattle moved to the lower pastures, firewood hauled and stacked, the equipment checked and repaired and winterized. Grace added a layer of wool to everything she wore and made soups and stews that filled the kitchen with warmth and steam. And in the evenings, the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and neither of them commented on how naturally they both gravitated toward it. There was a social gathering in Redemption on the 3rd Saturday of October, one of the town's periodic dances held in the feed barn near the livery, the kind of event that in a small town served the function of reminding everyone that they were still part of a community, and not simply isolated individuals surviving in proximity. Charles had not attended one of these dances in several years. He mentioned it at dinner on the Thursday before, mostly to inform the hands who might want to ride into town, and was surprised to find himself looking at Grace when he said it. "There is a dance Saturday in Redemption," he said. "Anyone who wants to go is welcome to ride the wagon in." Grace served the next man's plate without looking up. "I have bread to start on Saturday morning," she said. "Bread can wait a day," Charles said. She looked up then. "I am not much for dances," she said. "Neither am I," he said, and somehow this did not end the conversation the way it might have. He drove her to the dance on Saturday evening in the smaller buckboard, just the two of them, because most of the hands were already in Redemption, and Eli had been given the evening off to visit his family who lived 3 miles down the creek road. The drive took nearly an hour, and they talked for most of it, in the easy, flowing way they had developed over these months of evening conversations, moving from topic to topic without any particular agenda, and Grace found that she was not dreading the evening the way she had expected to. The feed barn was lit with lanterns and smelled of hay and humanity, and the particular sweetness of someone's homemade cider. A fiddle and a guitar were being played in the corner with more enthusiasm than precision, and the floor had been swept and scattered with sawdust for dancing. People were talking and laughing in groups along the walls, and several couples were already moving in the cleared center space. Charles brought her 2 cups of cider, and they stood against the wall watching the dancers, and Grace felt the strangeness of being somewhere that was not the ranch, somewhere with noise and crowd and light, and she felt the equal strangeness of how naturally Charles stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his arm. "Do you dance?" she asked him. "Poorly," he said. "I do not believe that," she said. "It is true," he said. "I step on feet." "You move well enough on horseback," she said, and then felt her face warm slightly at having said it, at having revealed that she had noticed. He turned to look at her, and the lamplight was in his eyes, and there was something there that was warm and steady and not at all casual. "Would you like to try and find out if I step on your feet?" he asked. She considered refusing. She had her refusal halfway prepared, the polite professional deflection she had been using for months to keep appropriate distance. But standing in the warm lamplit barn with the fiddle going and the cider in her hand and Charles Maddox looking at her with that steady, patient warmth, she found that she was tired of the deflection. She was genuinely, deeply, bone-tiredly tired of keeping things at arm's length and of carrying everything alone, and of the particular cold loneliness of a woman who has decided that needing people is too dangerous to risk. "All right," she said. He took her hand. His was rough and warm and large around hers, and he led her to the floor with a gravity and care that had nothing awkward about it, despite his self-deprecating claim. They moved into the pattern of the reel, and he did not step on her feet. He was not flashy, not skilled the way some of the younger men were, but he was solid and steady and present, and dancing with him felt like so many other things about him felt, like being held without being constrained, like being seen without being examined. They danced twice, and then the music slowed and shifted, and without discussing it they simply stayed on the floor for the slower song, and Grace found herself close enough to him to smell the clean scent of him, the wool of his coat and the cold air that had come in with people opening the barn doors, and she found that she had let herself settle, just slightly, just the smallest possible degree, into the warmth of being near him, and that she did not immediately pull herself back. He did not say anything. He simply danced, and held her hand carefully, and kept the proper distance that the time and place required, and was simply there. On the drive home, the sky was enormous and star-scattered above the dark land, and they talked quietly about small things, and Grace looked at the profile of him against the stars and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she had been so careful to prevent that she was not entirely sure she recognized it correctly. It was the sense of someone being genuinely good, not performing goodness or seeking credit for it, but simply being in their nature a person who could be relied upon. She thought about her father, who had been good in this same unremarkable, fundamental way, and who was gone. She thought about how it had been to love someone that way and then to not have them anymore. She thought about how the world went on regardless, dry and wide and indifferent, and how the only sensible response was to need as little of it as possible. And she thought about how tired she was of being sensible. She did not say any of this. She said goodnight to Charles at the door of the main house and went to her room and lay on her cot in the dark and listened to the horses in the paddock and the far-off howl of something in the hills. And she let herself feel it without trying to name it or manage it or put it away, just for the length of time it took her to fall asleep. November brought the first real cold, and with it a problem Charles had been hoping to avoid. The eastern fence line, which he had known was in poor condition since the summer, finally gave way along a half-mile stretch in the upper pasture, and 36 head of cattle found the gap and went through it into the rough country toward the foothills. 2 of the hands went after them, but the cattle had scattered badly in the broken terrain, and after 2 days of searching they had found most but not all of them. Charles spent 3 days out in the cold hills on horseback, coming back each evening late and mud-splattered and tight-jawed with the particular frustration of a man who had made a costly mistake he should have prevented. Grace kept supper warm for him each night and did not offer commentary on what was clearly an already painful situation. She simply made sure there was hot food and hot coffee and that the kitchen was warm when he came in, and she asked no questions about the cattle, because the number of cattle recovered was obvious from the look on his face each night, and she did not press. On the 3rd night he came in after full dark and sat down heavily at the table and looked at the plate she set in front of him with the expression of a man who is not sure he deserves to eat. "We lost 11, he said. "I know," she said. She sat down across from him, which she did not always do, usually maintaining the careful distinction between employer and employee by remaining near the range while he ate. But she sat down. "Eat your supper," she said. "Losses happen. You are not the first rancher to lose cattle to a fence failure." He looked at her. "I knew it was in poor condition," he said. "I should have had it fixed in September." "Yes," she said without softening it, because she understood that he did not want to be absolved, only witnessed. "And now you know to address fence repairs earlier. That is how you learn things in this kind of work. 11 head is a significant loss. It is, she agreed. It is not a ruinous one. Eat your supper. He ate. And some of the tightness in his jaw released. Not because the problem was solved, or even because she had said anything particularly wise, but because she had been honest with him rather than kind at the expense of honesty. And there is a specific comfort in being seen clearly by someone who nevertheless chooses to sit across the table from you. You are a practical woman, Grace Grady, he said. I have had reason to be, she said. Is that why you do not let yourself feel things? It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her. She went still for just a moment, not the shaking stillness of suppressed grief, but the alert stillness of someone who has been very gently caught at something. I feel things, she said. I know you do, he said quietly. I have seen you not feeling them. The silence between them was very careful. I do not know how to talk about this, she said. You do not have to, he said. I just wanted you to know that I see you, not the version of you that has everything managed, the whole of you. She looked at him for a long moment across the table, in the lamplight, in the warm kitchen that smelled of the supper she had made and the fire she had kept burning. And she could feel the careful architecture she had built around herself over years of loss and practicality and determined self-sufficiency developing hairline fractures, not collapsing, not yet, but cracking in the particular way that stone cracks before it admits the light. You are a dangerous man, Charles Maddox, she said, very quietly. I am not trying to be, he said. I know, she said. That is what makes you dangerous. She stood up and collected his plate, and the conversation was over, but neither of them forgot it, and everything between them was different after it, more honest and therefore more frightening, and therefore also, somehow, more like something real. December arrived, and with it, a letter that changed everything. The letter was from a man named Graves, a cattle broker out of Phoenix, and it contained a business proposition of the kind that Charles had been waiting for 3 years, the opportunity to expand the operation significantly by taking on a contract for beef supply to the new rail line being built east of Tucson. The contract was substantial, the kind of thing that could double the size of the Maddox operation within 2 years if handled correctly. It would require investment, and it would require bringing on additional hands, and it would require Charles to spend several weeks over the winter in Phoenix and Tucson negotiating the terms. He read the letter twice at the table, and then set it down and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, working through the mathematics and the risk in the particular private way he thought through serious problems. He told Grace about it that evening. He told her because she was a person who understood practical arithmetic and because she had demonstrated repeatedly that she would give him her honest assessment rather than the assessment she thought he wanted. She listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, about the terms of the contract and the front costs and the expected timeline. He answered them as accurately as he could. You should take it, she said. The risk is significant, but the operation can absorb it if the contract terms are what they appear to be. And you have been running at a level below this ranch's capacity. You have the land and the water for the expansion. It is only the capital that has been limiting you. You know this, he said. I have been keeping the household accounts for 4 months, she said. I read the figures. I do not have the cattle market knowledge you have, but I understand what the numbers say. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, an open, undisguised admiration that he made no effort to conceal. What would I do without you managing things here? He said, and then the slight change in his own expression told her he had heard the weight of what he had just said. The quiet that followed was different from their usual quiets. It was charged with something that had been accumulating for months and was now very close to the surface. You would manage, she said carefully. I know I would manage, he said. That is not what I said. She looked at the table, then she looked at him. Charles, she said. Grace, he said. I am your housekeeper, she said. You are, he said. And you are also the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and I have been aware of it since approximately the 2nd week you were here, and I have been trying to be respectful of what you need and what you are comfortable with and what you want, but I am going to tell you once plainly, and then I will not raise it again unless you do." He paused. "I am in love with you. I do not know at what exact point it happened, but it has happened thoroughly and without reservation, and I am telling you because you deserve honesty, and because I think you have been carrying something of the same thing without allowing yourself to call it what it is." The kitchen was completely quiet. The fire ticked. Grace Grady sat with her hands flat on the table and felt the architecture she had built crack properly this time, not crumble, not collapse into disorder, but open, like a door that has been stuck and now swings freely. She had thought, when she thought about this, that it would be frightening. And it was. But it was also the specific relief of something she had been holding at a great distance finally being allowed to come close. "You are right that I have been carrying it," she said. "I have been afraid of it. I know," he said, "because of what you have lost. Because I have needed things before," she said, "and the needing has always been expensive." "It can be," he said. "I cannot promise you it will not be. I can only tell you that what I feel is not going to change based on whether it is convenient or comfortable, and that I am not a man who makes promises he does not intend to keep." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. This man with his rough hands and his patient eyes and his quiet insistence on seeing her clearly whether she wanted to be seen or not. This man who had never pushed and never performed and had simply been, consistently, someone she could rely on. "I am terrified," she said. "So am I," he said. This surprised her. "You do not seem it," she said. "I am telling you about it without any certainty of how you will respond," he said. "That is one of the more terrifying things I have done." She looked at her hands on the table, and then she turned one of them over. An open hand facing up. A small gesture and an enormous one. He reached across the table and covered her open hand with his. They sat like that for a while, in the warm kitchen, in the December cold outside, and nothing needed to be said. He went to Phoenix in January for the contract negotiations, and he was gone for 3 weeks, which was the longest 3 weeks Grace had experienced since losing her father. She kept the ranch running with the same focused efficiency she always brought to it, managing the accounts and the household and the hands and the 1,000 small daily urgencies of a working cattle operation, and she did not admit to anyone, not even to herself at first, how much she missed him. But the kitchen in the evenings was a different place without him in it, and she had to stop herself several times from looking toward the door when she heard boots on the porch steps. He wrote her a letter from Phoenix. It was a practical letter, about the contract negotiations and the terms he was trying to secure, but it was also other things around the practical edges. It mentioned that the hotel food in Phoenix was inferior to anything she had ever made, stated as a fact and not a compliment. It mentioned that Phoenix was louder than he liked. It mentioned, in the final paragraph, that the negotiating table was not as comfortable as his own kitchen and that he hoped she was well. She read that paragraph 3 times. She wrote back. Her letter was also practical, about the condition of the cattle and a repair needed to the windmill and the state of the stores. In her final paragraph, she told him that Decker's arm had healed cleanly and that he had gone back to full work and that he had eaten 4 pieces of apple cake at Sunday dinner, which she mentioned because she thought it would make him smile. Then she crossed out that last part and wrote it again, and then crossed out the crossing out, and sent it with the last line intact. He came back on a Tuesday afternoon in late January when the sky was very blue and very cold, and the horses in the paddock were restless with the cold, moving in tight circles and tossing their heads. Grace was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon in the yard, and she made herself finish what she was doing, which was the bread, before she went to the door. He came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands and the cold air of the afternoon still on him, and he looked the same as he always did and also somehow different, the way a place looks different when you have been away from it and come back. "Contract is signed," he said. "Terms are good." "I am glad," she said. "How is the windmill?" "Fixed." Eli managed it with some instruction. "Good," he looked at her. "You look well." "You look tired," she said, which was true. "I am," he said. "Phoenix is exhausting. Too many people saying too many words without meaning any of them." "Sit down," she said. "I will make coffee." He sat down, and she made coffee, and the kitchen was the right shape again with both of them in it, and nothing needed to be discussed because everything that had been said in December was still said and was not going anywhere, and there was time now for all the rest of it. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday in February, in the most Charles Maddox way possible, which was to say quietly and directly, and without any theatrical production, while they were both in the barn doing the morning feeding, because one of the younger hands was sick, and Charles had taken his chores and Grace had come to help without being asked. He was forking hay into the stalls, and she was carrying water buckets, and in between the third and fourth stall he stopped and looked at her and said it. "Grace, I would like very much for you to be my wife. I believe we would make a good life together, and I know I would spend that life working to deserve you, and I am asking you plainly because you are a person who prefers plain things to performances." She set down the water bucket. She looked at him in the hay-dusty morning light of the barn, with the horses shifting in their stalls and the cold February air coming in through the open door, and she felt the fear come up, the old familiar fear of needing, of loving, of opening herself to the specific vulnerability of being loved back by someone you might someday lose. She let herself feel it. She did not push it away. She stood in the fear and breathed through it and understood, clearly and without argument, that the fear was real and also that it was not a good enough reason, that nothing she could build behind walls of practicality and careful distance would be as real or as worth having as this. "Yes," she said. He smiled, and it was the full version of the smile that usually only got as far as the corner of his mouth, and it was the best thing she had seen in a very long time. They were married in March at the small church in Redemption, on a Saturday when the air was just beginning to warm, and the desert was starting its brief, extravagant spring bloom, with the red earth and the dry land softened by scattered patches of color, yellow and purple and white, the way the Arizona spring always arrived, entirely without warning and entirely transforming. The hands came, Decker in his best shirt that he had clearly ironed himself with more determination than skill, Eli with his hair slicked flat, and his enormous hat actually on straight for once, the others arrayed behind them with the slightly formal bearing of men who have dressed up for something, and are not entirely comfortable with it, but are making the effort. Aldridge from the bank came, and the doctor who had treated Decker's arm, and Mrs. Farrell who ran the millinery in Redemption, and who had taken a liking to Grace in their brief encounters, and had somehow transformed that brief acquaintance into an enthusiastic investment in this wedding, appearing with a spray of dried flowers that she pressed into Grace's hands at the church door. Charles had asked Grace what she wanted for the ceremony, and she had said short and honest, and it was both. The preacher, a younger man than the one who had buried her father, said the words with meaning, and Charles said his vows in the same direct way he said everything, looking at her steadily with those brown eyes that saw everything, and Grace said hers, and her voice only wavered once, very slightly, on the word cherish, and Charles heard it, and his hand around hers tightened very slightly, and she steadied. Afterward there was food back at the ranch, tables set up in the yard because the day was warm enough, and there was music from a fiddle player Eli had found somewhere, and there was enough food for twice the number of people present because Grace had cooked for 3 days and had not been able to stop herself, and Decker ate 5 pieces of apple cake, which was a personal record, and was very solemn about it. That evening, when the guests had gone and the hands had drifted to the bunkhouse and the ranch was quiet under the early stars of a March evening, Grace stood on the porch of the main house that was now her house and looked out at the mountains and the darkening sky and the first horses settling for the night in the paddock, and Charles came to stand beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. Then, "Better than all right." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the way she was still learning to do, letting herself be held instead of bracing. And the stars came out one by one over the desert, and the night was very peaceful. She moved fully into the main house, of course, and the small room off the back became a study where she kept the household accounts and the correspondence, because it turned out that a ranch this size had considerable correspondence, and that Grace had a talent for it that far exceeded what Charles had been managing on his own. He had been losing or misplacing letters with embarrassing regularity before she arrived, and now the correspondence was managed with the same precise order she brought to the kitchen shelves and the household stores. Spring on the ranch was beautiful in the way that the Arizona spring always surprised even people who had lived there all their lives, the brutal land briefly deciding to be generous, the creek running clear and quick with snowmelt from the mountains, the pastures coming up green, the cattle in good condition from the winter grazing. Charles began the preliminary work of the expansion the contract required, the new fencing and the additional water infrastructure, and the conversations with neighboring ranchers about grazing access. And Grace was beside him in all of it, not decoratively but functionally, doing the kind of clear-eyed practical thinking that Charles recognized as complementary to his own in the specific way that the best partnerships work, each person seeing what the other misses. She also, in the spring, cried. This was something that happened on an ordinary morning in April, with no particular crisis attached to it. She was in the small study going through correspondence when she came across a letter she had not seen since before her father's death, a letter he had written to her from the farm outside Prescott in the year before they lost it, one of his cheerful, meandering letters about the crops and the neighbors and his plans for next season, written in his careful slanted hand, and she had not known it was in the bottom of her satchel all this time. She read it once, and then she put her face in her hands at the study desk, and she cried, fully and without restraint, for her father and for the farm, and for the years of hard practical distance she had kept between herself and her own grief, and for the fact that he had not lived to see her married, and for the fact that everything he had wanted for her, the safety and the steadiness and the belonging somewhere, she had found, and he would never know. Charles found her a few minutes later, when he came in from outside. He stood in the doorway of the study for a moment, and then he came in and crouched beside her chair and put a hand on her back and said nothing at all, just stayed, which was the right thing. She cried until she was done. This took a while. When she lifted her face it was blotchy and thoroughly undignified, and she did not care, and that was its own kind of revelation, that she did not care about being seen this way by this man, that being seen by him in pain was not something she needed to brace against. I found a letter from my father, she said. I know, he said. He was a good man, she said. I believe he was, Charles said. You could only have come from a good man. She looked at him and the tears started again briefly, and she let them. When they stopped again she felt lighter than she had in years, the way the air feels after a long-promised rain finally arrives. I should have done that months ago, she said. You did it when you were ready, he said. I was never going to be ready, she said. I was just eventually too tired to not do it. Sometimes that is what ready means, he said. She put her hand on the side of his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips briefly to her palm, and then he stood up and helped her up, and they went to the kitchen, and she made coffee and they sat at the table together in the April morning. And the letter from her father was on the table between them. And Grace told Charles about her father, the real telling, not the surface facts but the actual stories, the ones she had been keeping too carefully inside herself for too long. And Charles listened in the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and asked questions that showed he was actually hearing her, and she talked for a long time. She told him about her mother too, how she had died when Grace was 13, the fever that came in summer and was gone in a week, and left a hole the size of a life in everything afterward. She told him about following her father from one venture to another, always his optimism running slightly ahead of the reality, always her quiet steadying work behind the scenes keeping things functional while he planned the next thing. She told him how she had been angry at him, sometimes, for his impracticality, and how the anger had sat unspoken because he was good, and she loved him and anger felt ungrateful. She told him how at the end, in the back room of the livery stable in Redemption, she had held his hand while he slept, and she had told him quietly, in case some part of him could hear, that it was all right, that she was all right, that she was going to be all right. Charles was quiet for a while after she finished, the good quiet of someone who is holding space for what has been said rather than rushing to fill it. "You have been taking care of people since you were very young," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "You are also allowed to be taken care of," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I am learning it." "I plan to be here for the learning," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture she had made that December night, the open hand, and he covered it with his own, and that was sufficient. Everything that needed saying had been said, and the coffee was warm, and the spring morning outside the window was full of light. Summer came in hot and expansive, and with it the first real movement on the expansion, new hands hired and new fence going up along the extended pasture boundary, the first increased cattle purchases from a rancher down near Benson, who Charles had been talking to for years. The ranch grew louder and busier and more complicated, and Grace expanded to meet it with the same calm competence she brought to everything, hiring a girl from Redemption named Molly to help with the cooking and the heavier household work, teaching her with a patience that surprised Grace herself, who had not previously thought of herself as a particularly patient teacher. Molly was 17 and cheerful and dropped things at a rate that would have driven a less steady woman to distraction, but she was willing, and she learned quickly, and she had a quality of uncomplicated goodwill that made her pleasant company in the kitchen. And Grace found herself teaching the girl the way her mother had once taught her, with demonstration rather than instruction, showing rather than telling, and this felt like something passing forward rather than passing away. In August, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Charles on a Tuesday evening because she was a woman who did not build toward announcements, who did not delay the practical facts of a situation once they were confirmed. She told him at the kitchen table, as directly as she had ever said anything. He was still for a moment. Then the expression that crossed his face was one she had never seen before, not the steady competence or the patient warmth or the quiet humor, but something entirely unguarded and enormous, a happiness so genuine and so complete that it seemed to briefly make him younger. "A baby," he said. "In the spring, I think," she said. "March or April." He got up from the table and came around to her side and took both of her hands, standing in front of her, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her face in his rough hands and looked at her with an expression that required no words and that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Are you well?" he asked, meaning it in every sense. "I am very well," she said, and she was. She was frightened, yes, with the particular fear of the unknown and the vast responsibility of it, but underneath the fear was something solid and warm and certain, the sense of standing on ground that would not give way. He kissed her, properly and with great feeling, and she kissed him back, and Molly came in from the pantry at an inopportune moment and retreated immediately, making no sound whatsoever, which Grace noted later and which Molly never mentioned, because Molly, for all her cheerful carelessness with crockery, had excellent instincts about when she was not needed. The pregnancy was not easy. The first months brought a nausea that Grace managed by force of will, and by the discovery that plain crackers and ginger helped, and she resented bitterly the weeks when she could not be in the kitchen with hot food cooking without feeling ill, because the kitchen was her domain and her comfort, and she did not like being kept from it. Charles bore this period with the careful attention of a man walking near something fragile, which Grace also resented because she was not fragile, and she told him so, and he agreed with her readily, which she found almost more irritating than the original carefulness. "You are not fragile," he said. You are also making a person, which is not a small thing, and I am going to be attentive about your health because I love you and because I am going to be a father and I have not done this before and I am somewhat overwhelmed." She looked at him. "You are overwhelmed." "Considerably," he said, with the absolute honesty that she had loved him for before she knew she loved him. "I know cattle. I know range management. I know contracts and fencing and water rights. I do not know any of this." "Neither do I," she said. "We will figure it out." "I know we will," he said. "That does not make me less overwhelmed." She laughed, which was the first time she had laughed in 3 days of nausea and discomfort, and the laugh surprised her so much that she laughed again, and Charles smiled at her with the full smile, and Molly's voice from the pantry said, "I am just going to stay in here for a bit," which made Grace laugh harder. The nausea passed after the first months, and she entered the middle period of the pregnancy with a sense of robust health that she found almost suspicious, as though the body had been conserving its difficulties for later. She kept working, at a modified pace that she negotiated with herself rather than with anyone else, because she was still Grace Grady in her fundamental nature, even if she had accepted the name Maddox with genuine pleasure. And her fundamental nature included the firm conviction that she was the appropriate authority on what she could and could not manage. Autumn came again, the second autumn since she had arrived at the ranch, and she looked at the changing mountains from the kitchen window and thought about the first time she had seen them, arriving on the supply wagon with $12 and a worn satchel, and a stubbornness she had mistaken for strength. She understood now that the stubbornness was real, but that it had been wearing the wrong costume, calling itself independence when what it actually was fear. Real strength, she had discovered, looked more like Charles at the kitchen table saying, "I am overwhelmed," and more like her own open hand on a December night, and more like crying in the study in April with someone's hand steady on her back. She told Charles some version of this one evening when the mountains were purple with shadow, and the kitchen was warm and the baby, large enough now to make its presence unmistakable, shifted and kicked with the aggressive commentary she was learning to expect. "I was so certain that needing people made you weak," she said. "What do you think now?" he said. "I think that needing people is just what people do," she said, "and the only question is whether you find people worth needing." He looked at her over the lamp. "And have you found one?" he said. "I believe I have found several," she said. "Decker, for instance. I need him to eat enough apple cake to justify the amount I make." He laughed and she laughed, and the baby kicked again with apparent approval, and the evening was very good. The baby was born in the first week of April, which was exactly when Grace had estimated, a fact she found satisfying in the way she found all accurate estimates satisfying. The doctor came out from Redemption, a different doctor than the one who had tended her father, a younger man named Hartley who was calm and competent, and who appreciated that Grace was calm and competent in return. It was a long labor, longer than anyone had hoped, and Charles spent most of it in the hallway outside the bedroom door in a state of suppressed terror that Molly, who had appointed herself the handler of this situation, managed by the simple method of giving him repeated tasks. Go heat more water. Go tell Decker the news when there is news. Go walk around the yard because you are making the house feel anxious. He walked around the yard in the cool April morning, while inside the house Grace did the hardest thing she had ever done, which was considerable given the standard she set. And she did it the way she did everything, with focused efficiency and absolute determination. And when it was over and the doctor said it was a boy, and she heard the first sound of her son in the world, she was so tired that she could not do anything for a long moment except lie back and breathe. They brought Charles in after, and he stood beside the bed and looked at the child, this small and entirely new person that they had made together, wrapped in the flannel cloth that Molly had prepared, and his face was doing everything at once, and Grace watched him and felt a love for this man so complete and so without qualification that it was almost frightening, except that she had decided some time ago to stop being frightened of loving him. "He looks angry," Charles said. He has just been born, Grace said. He has reason. He has your chin, Charles said, looking carefully. He has your ears, she said. That is unfortunate for him, Charles said. I like your ears, she said, and she was so tired she was saying things without her usual filters, which was perhaps why she said the next thing too. I love you, she said. I have not said it plainly yet, and I should have. He looked at her. His eyes were bright with something that he also was not currently filtering. I love you, he said. I have said it before. You have, she said. I know, I was there. I remember every single time. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her very carefully, and she leaned against him with their son between them. And the doctor had gone, and Molly had tactfully absented herself. And the April morning outside the window was full of bird sound and the smell of the desert warming. And it was the best moment Grace Grady had ever experienced in her life. And she was clear-eyed enough to know it and grateful enough to simply be in it, without wishing it were anything other than what it was. They named him Thomas for her father, and Charles said this was the right name with the simple certainty with which he said anything he was sure of. And Grace had to close her eyes for a moment because her father would have loved this man. And she believed, somewhere that was not entirely rational, that her father knew. Thomas Charles Maddox grew in the way that healthy babies grow, rapidly and with apparent personal indignation at every stage of the process, as though life itself were something of an imposition that he was managing under protest. He was loud and demanding and curious, and from very early on he had the particular focused attention of both his parents, studying things with an intensity that Decker, who had appointed himself an unofficial grandfather in the way of old ranch hands who have nowhere else to put their considerable stores of gruff affection, said was going to make the boy either a very good rancher or a very troublesome philosopher. Grace recovered well from the birth, more quickly than she expected, and was back in the kitchen within 2 weeks over Charles's mild protest, which she overruled on the grounds that Molly could make adequate bread, but her biscuits were inconsistent, and inconsistent biscuits were not acceptable when there were 7 ranch hands to feed. She also began to laugh more. This was something she noticed herself doing in the months after Thomas was born, the way she noticed all internal changes, with a kind of quiet observation. She had always had a sense of humor, dry and precise, but the laughing had been rationed, kept close, deployed carefully. Now it came more freely, at the things Decker said, and the things Charles said, and the absolute absurdity of Thomas's opinions on everything from bath time to the sound of the windmill, and the laughing felt like something her body had been waiting to do for years. The ranch continued to grow. By the following year, with the rail contract fully operational and a second contract being negotiated for a line going north, the Maddox operation had expanded enough to require a proper foreman, a position that eventually went to one of the hands who had been there since before Grace arrived, a quiet, capable man named Tomas Vega, who had grown up working cattle in Sonora and knew the country better than anyone. He ran the operation with a calm efficiency that Charles trusted completely, and that freed Charles himself to handle more of the business side, which had expanded along with everything else. Grace discovered that she had opinions about the business side too. This was not entirely surprising to her, but it appeared to be somewhat surprising to Mr. Graves, the cattle broker in Phoenix, when he arrived in the fall to discuss the renewal terms, and found that Mrs. Maddox was sitting at the table for the conversation with a notepad and a series of questions that went directly to the points he had hoped to gloss over in the general goodwill of the meeting. Charles, watching this, was careful not to smile in a way that would undermine Graves's dignity, but it was an effort. "Your wife is thorough," Graves said to him afterward, in the way of a man who means something more complicated and is not sure it would be well received. "She is," Charles said. "It is one of her better qualities." Graves renewed the contract on terms that were more favorable than the previous ones, which Charles attributed entirely to Grace's questions in the meeting, and which Grace attributed to good preparation and the broker's own self-interest, which were both true. Their second child, a girl they named Margaret, arrived in the summer 2 years after Thomas, arriving with less drama and considerably more speed than her brother, as though she had taken note of his entry and decided to manage hers more efficiently. She had Grace's auburn hair from the first and Charles's calm demeanor, and Thomas, who was 2 and strongly opinionated, regarded her with the specific suspicion of a child who has been an only child and has just discovered this is no longer the case. Grace sat in the rocking chair in the nursery with Margaret sleeping against her shoulder and Thomas pressed firmly against her side, and she looked out the window at the Arizona evening, the long summer light going gold over the mountains, and she was so thoroughly, entirely, painfully happy that it made her chest ache, the way good things do when you have been without them long enough to understand their value. Charles came into the nursery and looked at the 3 of them in the chair. "Move over," he said to Thomas, who was occupying the space beside Grace with the total commitment of a 2-year-old who has staked a claim. Thomas looked at his father with an expression of profound reconsideration of this request, and then moved over approximately 2 inches. Charles sat on the arm of the chair instead, which was not particularly comfortable but was adjacent to what he wanted, and he put his arm around Grace and looked at the sleeping Margaret with the same expression he had worn looking at Thomas 2 years ago, unguarded and enormous and entirely his. "How are you?" he said. "Perfect," she said, and meant it without qualification. Decker died in the winter of the year Margaret turned 1, quietly in his sleep, in the way that old men who have lived hard lives sometimes are given the grace of going. Charles found him in the morning and stood in the cold bunkhouse for a while before he came to tell Grace, and she made coffee and they sat together, and Charles talked about Decker, the 30 years of riding with him starting when Charles was a young man just taking over the ranch from his own father. And Grace listened the way she had always listened, with her whole attention, and she thought about the dried apple cake wrapped in cloth at Decker's place at the table, and she was glad she had done it every time. Glad she had never made him ask, glad she had understood without needing it explained what it meant to want something without being able to say so. They buried Decker in the small cemetery plot on the eastern edge of the ranch land, a spot Charles had shown her once as the place where his parents were buried, under a single large mesquite tree that managed to provide shade without being asked. Grace put a piece of apple cake on the grave, wrapped in cloth. This was not conventional and she did not care. Eli, who was 17 now and no longer wearing a hat too large for his head, had to look away for a moment and then look back at the sky. Life on the ranch went forward, as life does. Thomas grew into a boy who wanted to be wherever the work was, following Charles on his rounds with the intensity of a person who cannot get enough of something, and Charles brought him along with the patient readiness of a father who understands that the best teaching is proximity. By the time Thomas was 5, he could name every horse on the property and their particular habits, and by the time he was 7, he was riding under supervision with the easy comfort of a child who has grown up around horses. And Grace watched her son on horseback and felt something move through her that was part love and part recognition, seeing in him the same focused attention that had drawn her to his father from the beginning. Margaret was different, not in the way of one child being more or less than another, but in the way of distinct natures. Where Thomas was fixed on the external world of horses and cattle and the wide open ranch, Margaret was interested in words. She learned to read early and with fierce enthusiasm, working through every book in the house, and then making her opinions known about the insufficiency of the supply. Grace ordered books from a catalog in Tucson, a variety that reflected her own intellectual breadth, histories and stories, and a natural philosophy text that was somewhat advanced for a 7-year-old, but that Margaret read with a dictionary beside her, looking up words with the same methodical pleasure she brought to everything. "She is going to be a school teacher," Molly said one afternoon, watching Margaret reading at the kitchen table while Molly and Grace prepared the week's preserving. "She is going to be whatever she decides to be," Grace said, which was perhaps not realistic for 1891, and she knew it, and she said it anyway because she also knew that the world could be argued with and that the best equipment for arguing with the world was a good education and a clear sense of one's own worth, and she intended to make sure Margaret had both. Charles, told of this exchange, agreed without qualification. "She has her mother's stubbornness," he said. "She will be fine." "I am not stubborn," Grace said. He looked at her. "I am determined," she said. "There is a distinction." "Of course there is," he said. The years settled into the shape of a good life, which is the shape that is hardest to describe because it does not have the sharp edges of dramatic events, but is rather a texture, the specific and irreplaceable texture of daily living with someone you love in a place you have chosen, the mornings with coffee and the evenings with lamplight, and the arguments that resolve because both people involved care more about resolution than about being right, and the laughter that comes easily now where once it was careful, and the way two people learn each other so thoroughly over time that they develop a shorthand for everything, a whole vocabulary of glances and small gestures that says everything. That needs saying. Grace still kept the household accounts with the precise attention she had always brought to them, and she managed the domestic side of the operation with the same capability that had led Charles to hire her in the first place. But these things were now done in partnership rather than in employment, which felt completely different even when the tasks were the same. She also, over the years, became involved in the wider operation in ways neither of them had initially planned. She had opinions about cattle purchasing that turned out to be sound, based on a combination of the figures she knew intimately, and a practical common sense that cut through the sentiment that sometimes affected Charles's decisions when he was dealing with ranchers he had known for years. She had opinions about water rights negotiations that were equally sound. She had opinions, offered directly and without apology, on most things that affected the ranch, and Charles received them the way he had always received what she said, with genuine attention and without defensiveness. They disagreed sometimes, properly and with feeling, the way people who respect each other and care about outcomes are permitted to disagree. They almost always found their way to something better than either original position, which is the best possible outcome of an honest argument. She planted a garden in the 4th year, which was not practical for an Arizona ranch, and she knew it and did not care. She chose plants carefully, things that could survive the heat with management, a mesquite tree for shade, a patch of desert marigold that bloomed vivid yellow against the red earth, an herb bed near the kitchen door with sage and oregano, and the small lavender plants she had ordered from a catalog, and that took 2 tries to establish, and then thrived with the stubborn persistence of things that were meant to be somewhere. Charles built her a bench in the garden, without being asked, setting it in the shade of the growing mesquite where she could sit in the evening when the heat had gone out of the day and watch the mountains change color. He built it on a Sunday morning while she was in the kitchen and placed it without ceremony and said nothing about it, and she found it that evening when she came out after supper and stood looking at it for a long moment. "You built me a bench," she said. "There was a good spot for one," he said. She sat on the bench and looked at the mountains, and he sat beside her, and the evening was full of cricket sound and the smell of the sage from the herb bed and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night, and Thomas and Margaret were asleep inside, and Molly had gone home to her family, and the ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet at the end of a good day when everything that needed doing had been done. "I think about the day I arrived sometimes," Grace said. "The supply wagon, the flour sacks." "I think about the list," he said, "the provisioning list you had ready before I even met you." "You hired me partly because of that list," she said. "I hired you entirely because of that list," he said, "and because of the way you said you were exactly what I asked for to Aldridge. He told me about that." "He told you. He wrote me a note," Charles said, and the smile was in his voice. He said the woman he was sending had answered every question before it was asked and was, quote, the most composed young woman he had encountered and furthermore entirely capable. He sent me anyway because you needed a cook, she said. He sent you because he knew a good thing when he saw it, Charles said. He was right. She looked at the mountains, gone deep blue now in the evening, the sky above them full of the first stars. This place that had been a stranger's ranch on a wagon road 12 miles east of a town she had barely known, this place that was entirely her own. I was so frightened, she said. When I arrived, I did not show it. I know, he said, I saw it anyway. You saw it when I was in the alley, she said, in Redemption, the second time. The first time too, he said. That first evening in the kitchen after the burial, you were terrified and exhausted and determined not to let any of it be visible. She turned to look at him. You never said anything. You did not want me to, he said, and you did not need me to. You needed me to sit at the table and talk about the weather, and I could do that. She reached for his hand in the evening dark, and he took it. The stars were coming out fast now, the way they did in the desert, appearing in clusters as the sky deepened, and the mountains were a dark shape against the last of the light. I am glad you could do that, she said. I am glad you stayed, he said. I was afraid you would not stay. I almost did not, she said honestly. I almost talked myself out of it. What kept you? She thought about this. The bench at the kitchen table, she said. The way you just sat down, you were not performing anything. You were just there. It is a good table, he said. It is, she said. We have had most of our important conversations at it. We will have more, he said. Yes, she said. We will. They sat on the bench in the garden as the Arizona night settled full and dark around them, and the stars were extravagant overhead, and the desert smelled of sage and cooling earth and the sweet faint dust of the day's work. And inside the house their children slept, and this life they had built together from the materials of loss and stubbornness and a quiet, patient love that had refused to be hurried, was as solid and as real as the red earth under their feet, as enduring as the mountains, as full as the sky that held every star it had ever been given, and always room for more. Grace Grady, who had buried her father with $12 and a worn satchel, and a stubbornness she had mistaken for strength, who had refused to cry in front of the cowboy and had stood with shaking hands and a set jaw in the alley of a small Arizona town while the world arranged itself against her, who had arrived at a stranger's ranch on a supply wagon and left the supply rider's flour sacks behind without looking back, had arrived here, at this bench in this garden under this sky, at this man's side. At this life. She had not planned it, she had not allowed herself to hope for it. She had simply, ultimately, been too tired to keep refusing it, and that, she had come to understand, was also a kind of bravery, the kind that did not announce itself, the kind that simply showed up every day and stayed.